In March, I was starting to think about what I would research for this project, and my first idea was to research Jackson Pollock. I started doing some preliminary Googling, and I ended up watching this YouTube video about the New York School of Abstract Expressionism that Jackson Pollock was a part of. Near the end of the video, it includes a list of the other innovative painters from this time.
But this should not diminish the real innovations of the painters of the time, such as Hans Hofmann, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, Lee Krasner, Barnett Newman, Clifford Still, Helen Frankenthaler, Willem de Kooning, just to name a few.
This was my first time hearing of Hans Hofmann, and his painting jumped out at me. It is almost nauseatingly colorful. The combination of colors makes me think of a child coloring wildly with crayons. But at the same time, the painting is so intricate, and it feels like there is some kind of mysterious logic to it. The blue oval at the top of the painting feels much more natural than the rest of the composition, like a window into an impressionist painting of the ocean. But if we're seeing the ocean through a window, then where are we? Hans Hofmann was born in a small town in Germany in 1880. When he was 6, his family moved to Munich, where his father did administrative work for the government. Hofmann studied math and engineering as a teenager. Then, when he was 18, he took his first painting lesson, and painting became his passion. In his 20s, he moved to Paris. At this time, Paris was the center of the Western art world, and modern art was being born in Paris in the form of Cubism and Fauvism. In 1905, Hofmann wrote in a letter that Paris was a baptism of fire in these years. In the 1920s, Hofmann moved back to Munich and started his own art school, which over time attracted students from around the world. In 1930, an American former student of his helped him move to America and find a job teaching art at UC Berkeley. Then, in 1934, he moved again, this time to New York, where he started his own art school. His new school became popular over the course of the 40s and 50s, in part because of the GI Bill. I was surprised to learn that his school qualified for GI Bill funding because it was such a bare-bones and experimental kind of school. But this was a unique historical moment when people were feeling very grateful to veterans, and the government was willing to pay for them to get whatever kind of education they wanted. At the same time, Hofmann earned a reputation as a great teacher because his school produced many successful artists. In fact, 2 of the abstract expressionists listed in the video from before attended Hofmann's school, Lee Krasner and Helen Frankenthaler. Even as Hofmann ran his own school, he also managed to maintain his own daily art practice. He produced over 1,000 paintings during his time teaching in New York. But his most popular paintings are from the last decade of his life, after he retired from teaching at the age of 78. At that point, he had 6 decades of experience with painting, and he was able to focus all his attention on his own art. Hofmann died in 1966 at the age of 85. Hofmann expresses the challenge of teaching art in this quote: "Being an artist and being a teacher are 2 conflicting things. When I paint, I improvise, speculate, and my work manifests the unexpected and unique. In teaching, it is just the opposite. One is forced to explain the inexplicable." So, how was Hofmann so successful at this seemingly paradoxical task of teaching art? In my research, I found 2 ways that Hofmann tried to explain the inexplicable. One is through demonstration. One of Hofmann's former students, Wolf Kahn, describes how Hofmann made his points directly on the student's drawing. Sometimes he really got into it. Then the drawing would undergo a storm of corrections taking as long as 10 minutes. So, sometimes, to make a point about shifting planes or to clarify space relations, he would ask the student's permission to tear the whole paper in pieces, which he then reassembled with tape and thumbtacks. When a student painted in class, Hofmann, undaunted, would ask for the brushes and the palette and would paint directly onto the student's painting. With these different techniques, it seemed like Hofmann tried to create a collaborative dynamic between himself and his students. This dynamic contributed to the artistic development of his students and the artistic development of Hofmann himself. His former student Sam Feinstein said this about Hofmann's use of rectangles in his late work. I think he got the idea for the rectangles from the critiques that he gave on Fridays. He used to have the class monitor bring a pile of rectangular construction paper, and in an effort to make a point about a student's paintings, he would take one of these colored papers from the pile and hold it against the painting to show the impact of such a color. I think it eventually got through to him that he could use that same idea of these rectangles in his own work. The other pedagogical tool that I want to talk about is theory. You can see in Hofmann's writing and in the writing of his students that he wanted to impart not only his techniques, but also his theoretical understanding of the nature of painting. Through his art theory, he translated his own personal experience of painting into something more open-ended, something that his students could turn around in their heads and then implement in their own ways. For example, there is his theory of flatness and depth. For Hofmann, the original flatness of a blank canvas was very important. He was not interested in paintings that impose three-dimensionality on the canvas through the traditional use of perspective. But at the same time, he did want to imbue the canvas with a special kind of depth that he called pictorial depth. A painting with pictorial depth is kind of like a diagram about depth, or a photograph of all the ingredients that go into depth, or something along those lines. The important thing is that when Hofmann was painting, he was trying to avoid two opposing versions of failure, destroying the flatness of the canvas and failing to transcend the flatness of the canvas. In my opinion, nobody but Hofmann can fully understand what he meant by these categories, but they did have a clear and distinct meaning to him, which made it so that painting for him was always a delicate balancing act. By its nature, this process was not something that he could teach directly, so as a teacher, he had to use language in creative ways to show his students the outline of a theory that they could fill in with their own intuitions. In conclusion, I want to propose a generalized version of Hofmann's theory that other artists could apply to their own mediums. The first step is to think about the essential limitations of your medium. Then, from those limitations, you derive two opposing versions of failure in your medium. These versions of failure should be so broad that it seems almost impossible to succeed in your medium. There should be a thin band of possibility that emerges between them like a tightrope. Then, you have to develop a practice of walking that tightrope, which means making art over and over again and failing most of the time in order to develop your skills and your judgment. This is a gradual, lifelong process, so at the same time, you also have to work on building a sustainable life for yourself. From this perspective, part of the task of an artist is to stay alive and healthy so that you have the opportunity to do your best work in your old age, like Hans Hofmann.